In one of the Eastern sacred books, there is a section called the Parable of the Plants. And because it has a very direct bearing upon our thought this morning, I'd like to summarize it briefly. The story is, in effect, that once upon a time, there was a drought in the land, and farmers, shopkeepers went to their temples to pray for rain. And it came about that their prayers were answered, and a great cloud appeared in the sky. And this cloud was heavy with rain, and after a time the rain drenched the earth. And all the hungry things of the earth drank up the rain. Plants, and flowers and trees, all kinds of creatures were benefited by this shower that came at a most necessary time. Now, as the sacred book tells us, the rain was all of one substance, what we call water. And yet this substance, falling upon a parched earth, performed almost immediately an infinite diversity of labors. Each plant, taking this rain into itself, adapted the water to its own need. And out of this single storm came beauty of 1,000 kinds, and health and happiness, security for countless millions of living things. Yet these living things did not receive with this rain any curious indoctrination. It was not rain to cause one particular purpose only. It did not have within it only the power to touch one kind of life. It did not only give red to the rose or green to leaves. This rain gave all colors to all things. It did not slack the thirst of one kind of creature, nor did its waters benefit men of one faith or one race or one nation. The rain came, and there was rejoicing among all that lives. This is the thought behind the philosophy of this particular sacred book. Wisdom is like rain. Truth is like rain. Enlightenment is like rain. It brings the great energies of life to everything that is in need. And every creature interprets these energies according to its own needs. And there is no dogmatism. There is no insistence in nature that a plant have a certain shape or an animal be of a certain type. Whatever is necessary, the universe provides. And that which is most necessary to the thirsty earth of man is wisdom. Wisdom descending from the universe itself. Wisdom interpreted in the habits of little insects, in the song of birds, in the growth of plants, and in the labors of mankind. Thus one great principle vitalizes all the necessities of existence. And among the necessities that it vitalizes must be all the attributes and qualities of human nature. There is not a wisdom for the heart that is different from the wisdom of the mind. For this life power makes the heart and mind to live. There is no wisdom for one age or for another age primarily, for rain has always been necessary since the beginning of things. Rain will always sustain the life as it is at the moment when the rain falls. It will always be useful. It is not old, it is not new. It is the eternal quencher of eternal thirst. Now, in the case of man, we have more or less forgotten some of the attributes of this mystery of plants and the rain. We have forgotten that human beings possess within themselves a very complicated structure for the expression and revelation of the energy within them. And so it happens that when intelligence, knowledge, all these different attributes manifest through man, they take on the peculiar coloration of man's need. They belong primarily to man. Man's world is unique to himself because it comes from within himself, but it is also sustained by the same rain of life, the same energies, the same universal laws that protect every other creature or type of existence in space itself. Thus, in Eastern philosophy, particularly perhaps, we find emphasis upon the mystery of man's usages of the great benevolencies of life. We find that man, because of his own structure, because of the instruments within himself, must make his own unique application of the same life that sustains all other creatures. This life coming into manifestation through man is therefore conditioned in a particular way, just as the rain falling upon the plants produces in some flower, and in others it produces great trees, in some fruit, and some blossom only. So each kind of life interprets one life principle. Man, thinking about this one life in all things, perhaps as Akhenaton, Pharaoh of Egypt, thought about it 1400 years before the birth of Christ, man has come to the conclusion that the sun, light itself, was the peculiar symbol of life for him. It was this sun that shone upon everything, that was no respecter of beliefs, in no way withheld its benefits for any reason from any creature. And this sun, this light, striking into the mind of man, makes the mind fruitful. Striking into the body gives it strength and energy. Striking into the heart gives it affections and friendships. This energy is in itself good. This energy of its own nature and of its own condition has been always regarded as benevolent. Now, why should we particularly interpret it as good? Perhaps in other creatures around us, this interpretation has never arisen. Perhaps to most forms of life, life is simply life. It is not this life or that life. It is not a life to be subjected to morality or to ethics, because these creatures are simply incapable of unmoral action or unethical existence. They live in the law, they fulfill it, they are part of it. They live in truth as the fish lives in the ocean. But in man, there is this mental pattern that has been created and sustained by energy. Man emerges as a thinker. He emerges also as a questioner. He begins to study and examine all these laws and principles and activities with the power of his own thinking. And because his own thinking is not perfect, it is never inevitable that his conclusions will not all be right. But still he maintains them, and still he explores into the unknown in search of greater truth. But because man has a particular nature of his own, light takes its own shape in him. It moves through him according to man's own expressions. and it creates for man a universe unique to man, and another creature, even though it resembled man, with a different attitude, with a different pattern, with a different internal psychic integration, would live in a different kind of world, because he would fashion it according to his mind's convictions and his heart's desire. The most important point, probably, in the story of man is his effort to create an integrity. Man has been forced to discover realities that other creatures perhaps experience without question. Man, because of his own mind, finds himself separate or distinct or apart from other forms of life. He feels the need for bridges to unite him to other living things. He senses the loneliness of his own isolation. And in the course of his interpreting of life, he must interpret with the powers that he has. And these powers are his thoughts and his emotions and his attitudes and his feelings. And because of man's own internal response to the energy of life and light, he creates civilizations. He creates his own way of life. He creates his own concepts as to the purpose of the universe. These creations of his own are valuable only to himself. On another planet or in another region, they would be meaningless. And even here on earth, flowers and trees and birds and all kinds of creatures find no need for the peculiar interpretations that man puts upon things. Man's interpretations also seem to arise from something in himself that is the result of his own long, strange path of experience. Within him, man senses a kind of integrity. He does not know just what it is. He does not always have the strength to live it every day. But somewhere in the deep nature of his own being, man has experienced the quality of good as being something desirable, something valuable. He has also gained the experience of security, and he prizes it above the insecurities which surround him. He has gained the internal realization of the value of peace, even though he cannot refrain from conflict. Inside of man, the great universal principles of existence have interpreted themselves, therefore, through the terms of a great morality and ethics. And this morality and ethics has ultimately come to be identified with a deity. In some mysterious way, man has come to the conclusion that this tremendous energy which sustains him is carrying within itself the will of an eternal God. That this will is manifested through the laws and operations of nature. Man has subtly realized also that this universe is ruled by laws and not by beings, and that all beings in space are, in a sense, the servants of eternal laws. And man, in his own experience, has been forced to interpret natural laws morally and ethically. Now, in the rise of modern science, man searched desperately for these laws, and in finding them, he tried to denude them of their peculiar personalisms. Man tried to establish the conviction that laws exist, whether man exists or not, and that the various interpretations that men put upon laws, making them ethical, moral, spiritual, cultural, all these interpretations are merely expressions of man's own need. The East will not deny this Western point of view. It will only add to the general subject the point that man within himself has a core of basic need. And this core of basic need must inevitably and eternally interpret law in terms of virtue. Man is this kind of creature. Try to convince him that the law in which he exists is not virtuous, and you sicken him. You take away from him part of his own humanity. It is as though you refuse to permit the red rose to have its red blossom. It would not be possible, in terms of color and things of that nature, to hold the position that science has taken. But we forget, as Lord Bacon pointed out, the colors of good and evil. We forget that nature, in its infinite dissemination of energy, is not only bestowing physical growth and physical propagation upon things, but is bestowing upon all creatures with internal, spiritual, mental, and emotional powers the energy necessary to sustain these powers. We cannot evade this. We cannot try to create a sterile universe and then force man to inhabit it. We cannot, because man must inhabit a universe of his kind, a universe fashioned by his need, interpreted by his insight. We cannot take all this away from man and still have him man. The more we take away from him, the less he becomes. The more we add to him in terms of insight, the greater he becomes. And we must yet recognize that the universe can be known to man only by the power of man. Only by the faculties and abilities which he possesses does he contact or exist in the environment which we know as this world. Destroy him inwardly, and you destroy his world outwardly. Add to his inward stature, and you add to the security of his environment. No matter how we wish to look at it, this rain that fell upon the plant fell also into the mental life of man, giving it fruitfulness, helping it to fulfill its own purpose. If we deny this purpose or destroy this purpose or seek to frustrate this purpose, forcing man to live according to a code foreign to his consciousness, we do not improve him. We do not rescue him from superstition. We take him away from his proper place in life, where it is proper for man to dream. It is proper for human beings to hope. It is proper for mortal creatures endowed with faculties to worship, to venerate, and to regard. If these forces are in one way or another crippled, man becomes psychologically crippled. And the moment this happens, we observe around us that man sickens inwardly. And to the degree that he sickens inwardly, he destroys the integrity of his environment. Today we are duly concerned with the problems that are taking place in the world. A few of us do sense that the conditions that exist have to be lawful, whether they are desirable or not. They are the products of the operation of the law of causality. Nothing that exists today that is unfavorable or destructive to our survival was simply generated. It is not a process of something coming out of nothing. Every situation that exists is the natural, reasonable, and proper result of causes. And all these causes had their effect innate within themselves, and in the course of time these causes produce their fruit in the term of effects, and the same life that waters the plant makes certain that these fruits will be according to the nature of the plant in which they grow. So today we are faced with a problem which is not an accident, not a coincidence, not merely a passing phenomena that can be wiped away with an intellectual platitude. We are facing an evolving, unfolding negation that has its roots and origin within our own natures. For everything in the world that pertains to man is conditioned by man. We are not complaining at the moment because of the contamination of the bees and the birds. We are not blaming nature, nor have we any right to blame nature. We have no right to assume that our troubles are due to the rivers or the streams or the mountains or the valleys. Our troubles are due not to the land in which we live, but the way in which we live in that land. And these difficulties must bear their fruit according to their kind. And if we wish a different harvest, we must plant a different harvest. If we plant a good harvest, then the great rain of life will fall upon it, and it will mature. If we plant weeds, the rain will also bring them in rich abundance. We get what we earn. And the problem we face today is to rescue ourselves, at least in part, from this strange notion that there is no reason in space. We have to go back to the ancient fact that light itself bears reason within it, that everything that happens bears witness to the reasonableness of the universal processes, that there is no way in which man, a moral creature, can assume that the life that sustains him does not express itself morally. It has to, because it has to express in him and through him according to the colors of his own nature. With this basic thought in mind, we see that a vicious situation has gradually developed. On the one hand, man himself has gradually turned from the orderly interpretation of his own rights and privileges as a creature. Man is failing to use the faculties with which he is endowed for the purposes for which they were intended. He has taken his mind, a part of which at least should have been dedicated to the solution of the mystery of himself, and turned this mental energy entirely toward the expansion of his material civilization. He has gradually relinquished his rights. He has permitted himself to pass from his original government, which was rulership by law, to an artificial and uncertain government, which is rulership by men. This condition cannot continue without ultimate difficulty. It does not mean that laws do not need to be administered by men. For where humanity exists, this is part of the pattern. But the laws must not be created by men for their own conveniences alone, but must arise from a contemplation of universal purpose. The lawmaker must know within himself the result of the various patterns which exist in society, and he must turn always and forever to the study of the universe to discover the real legislations upon which survival depends, until he again realizes his utter dependence upon the great moral structure of law. He will not be able to guide his peoples or the citizens of his community or the members of his family into a safe, secure, and peaceful way of life. As man internally turns away from the moral contemplation of value, as he closes off the intuitive faculties of his own consciousness, which reach out for a seeking after cause, and becomes more and more absorbed in the simple process of daily existence, he dooms this existence because he removes from it the directive of his own consciousness. An existence without directive will almost inevitably drift into negation, especially man's existence, because man was created with faculties which made it necessary for him to become self-directive in order to survive. As man continues to pour his own weaknesses into society, Society, in turn, takes on the general complexion of this weakness. Little by little, the lawful and proper ways of doing things are sacrificed. More and more, the individual becomes a ruthless hunter upon the face of the earth. In his ignorance, in his selfishness, in his indifference to true value, he begins to prey upon man, causing the consistent unfoldment of negative patterns. Corruption by degrees takes over, until finally states, empires, communities find themselves tangled in a disaster of corruptions. To avoid this situation, we must find out where it actually begins. There's only one way, one place in which human society can begin, and that is in man. Man set up nations. Nature did not demand them. Man set up societies, learned orders. He established religions, philosophies, and sciences. He created legislations. He fashioned various systems of government. He set up the boundaries which divide states. He unfolded the lingual differences which divide us by language. He also released from himself arts and sciences of all kinds, suitable for the various needs which he felt to be arising within the society which he had fashioned. And from the beginning of time, man has used all his resourcefulness to protect, preserve, and sustain the patterns which he himself established. It is no problem as to whether nature demands that there be one kind of government or another. What nature demands is benevolent government, intelligent government, government dedicated to the common good of those that dwell within it. Its name is not important, but its integrity is inevitably necessary. So nature brings forth good things out of good efforts. It brings forth mediocre things out of mediocre efforts. And if the individual sows the whirlwind, nature will give him a harvest of whirlwinds. There can be no other approach to this very basic issue. So we come back to the individual. We come back to him because through him must pour into manifestation both the strength and weakness of humanity's way of life. Today there is too much weakness and too little strength, too much compromise, too little character, too much luxury, too little labor. Everywhere man is using his faculties and powers merely to gratify appetite and instinct. And in nature, if we go back through history, if we go back and watch the inevitable operations of laws, we realize that the attitude we are fostering at the present time has never produced anything but disaster. It is contrary to the right use of man's mental, emotional reserves. It is contrary to the purpose for which energy is given to man. And where the human being takes a universal energy, misapplies it, perverts it, he is then guilty truly of what the ancients called sin. Sin being to break the laws of the universe, or the laws of God, whereas crime is to break the laws of men. Today we see the constant complication of human affairs, due in total to the continuing stream of negation that pours through man into society. Energy conditioned by human selfishness is contaminated, and therefore flowing out into society produces contamination. There can be no answer to this except to change the course of the natural energy moving from man himself. If a sufficient number of individuals become involved in negative misuses of energy, we find the society to which they belong damaged. This society, in its turn, is the environment in which new generations must grow. This environment, if it is wrong, adversely conditions those who come into the world. From this wrong environment, pressures return upon the individual, forcing him to lower his own standards of conduct, forcing him to fight more desperately for the simple values which should be our proper birthright. So the environment sickens the individual as the result of the individual himself sickening his environment. These two work together, and in our pattern of existence cannot be completely separated. Today we belong to one of many forming a family of nations. Every nation has to have its own program, its own pattern, its own purpose. But all these must be essentially right, lawful, and proper. Today we are in a very strategic position in world affairs, but due to the failure of values within our own structure, we are in constant hazard of losing this strategic relationship to the family of world powers. Somewhere, we as a people must establish a way of life. We cannot indoctrinate the world politically and have anything more than political confusion. We cannot feed the hunger of the earth with our surpluses forever, because ultimately we will discover that our resources become exhausted, and these other peoples will still be hungry. We cannot, by physical means alone, maintain world peace. We cannot, by physical strength alone, prevent the danger of future war. Nor can we, by the highly skillful mechanization of our resources, assure any degree of happiness to our own people. We have the wrong approach to the entire situation. And whether we are speaking now of a nation or an individual, we are confronted with identically the same problem. An individual in difficulty can be variously treated and can go from one expert to another for the best part of a lifetime and still be sick. There is only one remedy for the sickness of an individual, and in principle it is the same remedy as that for the sickness of the world. Either the individual must reorganize his own basic life, providing a proper medium for the expression of universal energy through his own nature, or he will continue to be sick. If he pollutes his vitality at its source, it cannot sustain his mind, emotion, or his body, and flowing through his actions, which will then be highly conditioned. This lack of integrity will finally pollute his society. So we have to start at the very beginning. We have to go back to the problem of re-educating human beings. Whether we will do it or not is a very moot question. For those who have charge of these things are sitting smugly in their ivory towers and doing nothing. They are quite certain that if 2 wrongs make a large wrong, 3 wrongs should make a right, and they will continue to do this because they seemingly lack the basic intelligence to do better. The reason why they have lost this basic intelligence is that they have failed to cultivate it in themselves. Therefore, they cannot disseminate it to others, nor can they permit it to flow out into society. The idea that there is some simple little remedy by which all troublesome things can be made good is vanity. There is no such simple remedy in the terms that we are looking for it. For what we are looking for is effortless simplicity. We are looking for a kind of simplicity that comes in bottles or cans. We are willing to pay a small amount for it, preferring, of course, to buy it wholesale if possible. We do not wish to face the fact that a successful life has to be a planned life. that a happy life has to be one established in principles which are suitable to produce happiness, and that these principles are actually available to our insight at all times through the natural processes of universal law. Even if we assume that man can learn only by trial and error, we have all had enough opportunity for trial and error to perceive where the values are. We cannot continue to insist that we do not know better. We can only remember or try to perpetuate the idea that we can do as we please, and that somewhere in this great mystery of society, all our private mistakes will flow like the sewerage of a great city into the ocean and be purified. As a result of this happy thinking, we have succeeded in polluting most of the oceans, and we are endangering the lives of the creatures that live there. We cannot go beyond a certain point of absorbing our own and other people's mistakes. After we reach this saturation point, we are simply destroyed by some form of physical or psychological epidemic. Our beginning, then, must be to recognize the kind of world that man was intended to inhabit. Man was intended to create a world by the creativity of his own thoughts and emotions, to make this world intentionally beautiful. Whereas other creatures live according only to the impulses and instincts of their kinds, man was bestowed intuition, that he might not only unfold a better life, but that in the course of time he might truly become an administrator of universal law. If man could unfold his natural resources, he could take hold upon law. He could assist nature in its operations. He could advance the causes and purposes that are obviously locked within laws, so that life would grow more rapidly and beauty would unfold more completely through man's cooperation. Having failed to realize this need for cooperation, man has simply exploited laws, trying to adapt them to his own selfishness rather than adapting himself to their own eternity. In the solution of this, we have to go right back to the beginnings of life. We have to begin to evolve a science, or an art, or a philosophy, or a religion, or whatever you want to call it, that is based primarily upon man's convictions about value, convictions sustained by experience, not convictions based upon theory, but convictions based upon history, upon biology, upon all the sciences that we know, but convictions made luminous because man has discovered through arts and sciences that energy interpreting itself through him becomes moral and ethical and must be directed in a moral and ethical way. If we can get this point a little more generally appreciated, we can begin to help people also in their various difficulties. Looking around us today, most of us feel that the world isn't very much help to us. It preserves our physical maintenance. It gives some of us an opportunity to work. It gives various protections in sanitation and hygiene and things of this nature. But when it comes to the world becoming an instrument for common benevolence, it has almost completely failed. We have no real confidence anymore in the actions of each other. We are suspicious of even the most generous and unselfish gesture. We are doubtful of everything. We are disillusioned and embittered by conditions over which it appears we have no control, and conditions which offend us internally as being unreasonable or inconsistent with the integrities that we cling to so desperately in our own hearts and minds. In the world, then, we have the manifestation of personal pressures. And the world becomes a great collective made up of these personal pressures, and then reacts upon individuals, producing a situation that appears to be completely unreasonable, and causing many individuals to feel that there is no law and order, and that this tremendous mass of collective pressure is so great, so terrible, that no individual can withstand it, and that regardless of whether he lives honestly himself or not, he is bound to be a victim of the collective pressure. This destroys his sense of morality. This takes him out of an ethical universe and restores him to a jungle. He does not see how any one person can stand against this vast, complicated chaos which the ignorance and selfishness of other human beings is gradually creating. There's only one way in which we can reach this conclusion. We can come to some constructive answer to this. Obviously, nature has a solution. Nature will never permit anything to reach a condition in which it cannot correct itself. If things appear to be so bad that nothing can be done, the ancients believe we had a deluge and started over again. But in our modern thinking, we're inclined to suspect that the problem is the deluge, that the very confusion in which we live is the real flood which threatens to engulf us. But that in this emergency, in this greatly pressured problem, there is always a solution available. Men are not bound finally to each other in the sense that they must drown together. Men are actually bound as individuals to a great source of life. And in this great source of life, they have their root and their substance. And this is not easily corruptible. In fact, we have no evidence that the great universal source of life can ever be corrupted by the attitudes of any of its creatures, because it is infinitely superior to them and independent of dependency upon them, but they are dependent upon it. Philosophy then gives us the only available answer that we have to this problem, and it is supported religiously, and it is coming more and more to be suspected scientifically and psychologically. And that is that there is no time in which the individual has to be a victim of collective decadence unless he personally surrenders his right to be an individual. It is true that in times of great stress, it is more difficult to think straight. On the other hand, there are greater inducements. The person who is in real difficulty is frequently the only one who is willing to change his ways. So the law of cause and effect, by setting up pandemonium in society, forces the individual either to admit his defeat, which he is reluctant to do, or else find the solution. And up to now, history reports that always in these problemed crises, solutions have been found. They are not ultimate solutions, but they are the next thing that can be done in a condition as it exists. If we recognize, therefore, that all these problems of contaminated energy must originate in our own contaminated attitudes, then we have the right to change these basic attitudes. We have the right to rescue ourselves from the common dilemma. Now, this rescuing of ourselves does not entail nearly the difficulties with which we are likely to associate the process. All right, we will face the natural fact of things. We are not going to make 100% successful rescue at the moment. But we have a good possibility of a 50% improvement. And a 50% improvement would probably lengthen the constructive life of our culture by 1,000 years, simply because we are moving in the right direction. And one thing that nature seems to have great admiration for is a good try. And that is the thing that we have not been accomplishing. Now, we are all living together, but we are bound together by, again, a philosophy of life. We are bound together by certain moral, ethical, mental, emotional, or spiritual overtones. A family is not bound together by the laws of marriage. It is bound together by the attitudes of the members. A country is not bound together by its boundaries, nor by the various legislative procedures which seemingly hold it together. It is held together by the common cooperation of its people. It is held together because it is valued by its people, admired, respected, and served. And its people, if necessary, are willing to make great sacrifice to maintain that country. The real ties in things are the ties of character, of ethics, morality, and culture. And these are the ties which ultimately must bind individuals together. There is no use hoping that we can reform laws sufficiently in our material pattern to build bulwarks against the weaknesses in human nature, because the very laws themselves, as time goes on, will be weaker and weaker as more weakness is manifested in each generation of legislators. There will not be any possibility of gradually finding strength by the endless continuation of the process of weakening. The individual, in his dilemma, must finally face a very simple fact in life, and that is, we have all been endowed with the power and the means to fulfill those convictions which we most secretly and basically conceive to be right. If we have in the root of ourselves, or have learned and have gradually come to accept, the reality of an adequate ethical moral code, that this code is a basic one, is the important thing. It hasn't a particular subsection for every little action that man performs. It is not a massive volume like the traffic regulations of a city. It is a very simple code. It is a code of value. It is a code that has descended to us from the benevolent and wise and good of all time. And it has been tested and proven by generations of living beings. This code or credo or concept or doctrine or essence or principle or truth is in some form available to us all. It is available to many through their churches. It is available to others through their various educational activities. It is available throughout industry in the simple management of a business. Everywhere law and order must prevail, and value must be real, or ultimately the structure falls apart. If we are willing then to accept certain basic rules, if we are willing to accept that energy provides us with the means of being right, we have the situation rather reasonably in hand. It only then becomes necessary for us to use our energy in terms that we know to be the best use. This problem does demand a good many sub-factors. We cannot perhaps reach into the life of a completely materialistic individual and tell him to do whatever he pleases. This is not the answer. We have to give the individual an opportunity to know what is good. Now, many of our great universities have slogans, and among these slogans, a number are summarizing the same attitude, namely that the purpose of education is to make available to man the implements of his race. That the purpose of education is to fit the individual to make use of the attainments of society and enable him to proceed in this present life, supported as fully as possible by all the wisdom that has gone before him. This is the theory, but this is not the practice. And it's about time it became the practice. The beginning of our changes must arise within our educational structure and in our homes. It must mean that for the first time in recorded history, man is given a clear insight into the heritage which he has received from his own kind. He must not only be told about wars and battles and imports and exports. He must be told about values. He must realize that the priceless heritage which has descended from the past to every modern people is the heritage of culture, the heritage of insight, the heritage of the unfolding of the natural, simple virtues of man, the heritage of the realization that only by living within the pattern of universal principles can we live well and happily. And also a clear statement of at least a few of these basic principles, and perhaps an even clearer statement of the fact that the individual who lives according to these principles shall have status, shall be regarded as successful, shall be admired, respected, and honored, and that dishonor will come to the individual who breaks these principles, whether he attains material superiority or not. That these principles are the basis of his humanity, and to live contrary to them is to deny his place in human society. What he gets out of it, how important he becomes to other foolish people, is not the issue. The issue is that the individual either maintains the level of insight, moral and ethical, natural to humanity, or in all essence and substance, he cuts himself off from humanity. He becomes less than a human being, no matter how successful he may appear to be in this process. He is less because he is also inevitably going to run into the retributional processes of life. And what appears to be highly successful at the moment is the foundation of future tragedy. So we start in by strongly pointing out that the individual, particularly in mature years, does not even need to go to school to learn these things. All he needs to do is to read a few basic books, study a few basic concepts, read the 10 Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount, and begin to live according to them. Realizing that this is his humanity. This is the basis of his own psychic health. This is the only way in which he can protect himself from the inevitable consequences of breaking universal laws. He can do this because actually the inner life of the person is his own. Now, there's a great deal of talk in these areas about what happens to people who try to live better than their world. They are warned that if they do not make these necessary compromises, they will be in trouble. I have news for them. When they do compromise these principles, they are in trouble. And when we say trouble, I do not mean that they are having arguments with the Lord. I mean that they are in trouble in the fact that 50% of them are mentally sick, and about 500,000 every year land in mental institutions because they think they are better than truth. and they think that doing what they want to do is more important than doing what is right. These people are in trouble. One individual may say, I'm afraid I'll lose my job if I become honest. If he does not become honest, the job will lose him, for he's going to drop dead one of these days out of the conflict in his own personality. He can't stand it. He is being forced by values beyond his own power to a conflict between the causal core of life within himself, which is essentially right, and this infinite complexity of mental compromises which he has come to term living. So we think very strongly that the only reason why a great many people continue to make the basic old mistakes is because those who have previously made the mistakes are no longer here to advise them. They died of their own mistakes, and the world forgets them. Each individual, however, suffers through these pains himself. And when he is gone, he is unable to pass on any record of his own tragedy, even to his own children. But each person has to live these values or he is in trouble. It sounds very ominous when we start talking about these things. It sounds like the individual has to do every kind of thing that he doesn't like to do. But such is not actually the case at all. Most persons find there is a great and wonderful satisfaction in doing things well. We find in the long run that life is much better if we live it graciously. There is no real rule that says we have to be obnoxious in order to be happy. There is no reason why we have to live in constant conflict, trying to defend opinions that have no particular value one way or the other. We can simplify and reduce these pressures very greatly by just a little gentle common sense. So we begin to think about building a different attitude toward values and trying to find this attitude and live it. Now, perhaps we are not going to change the course of collective history by trying to do these things, but we are certainly at least going to contribute something positive to the great collective mystery of which we are a part. At least we are no longer going to contribute to the miseries of others. We are going to stop being miserable ourselves. For as long as we are miserable, we are going to make other people miserable whether we know it or not. The beginning of our problem in this Western civilization to which we belong is the recognition that we all have within ourselves the power to rule ourselves. We all have the power to demand the kind of nature or temperament that is acceptable to ourselves. We have the right to decline to think negative, evil, or destructive thoughts. We do not have to think them. Certainly they well up in our minds or in our emotions. We just feel terrible and we want everyone to know about it. But this is not necessary. There is nothing that tells us out of experience or nature that we have to gossip. There is no proof in the universe that there is any value demanded by nature as the result of our tearing down the character, reputation, or happiness of someone else. There is no law that says we have to be envious or jealous or hateful or nurse grudges or worry ourselves to death or be frightened of our own shadows. These are not edicts. These are not qualities of our natures which simply have to be there. They are no more necessary than a miserable, untrained child in a family is a necessity. But if nothing is done about the child long enough, it will become what appears to us a necessary evil. There is no reason why the individual, as I have known a great many, have managed to go through life with complete personal satisfaction who have never opened the pages of a good book. There is no reason why a person should find it impossible to enjoy good music. There is actually no reason why anyone should not study, learn, and seek truth to the last day of his life. There's no law against it. He'll get a great deal more out of it than he will trying to follow the continuous programs on television. Because the one thing he will not find there is truth. It is not necessary for us to find relief for our nervous tension by going out in a desperate battle on the freeways. This is supposed to be recreational. It is a slow form of suicide. We are not required by nature to do any of these things. So we do hundreds of painful things that are not necessary and completely decline to do a handful of necessary things that would bring peace or happiness or well-being or honor to our own lives and those around us. It is simply because impulses arise. The moment the impulse comes, it becomes a demand. To us, our own slightest wish becomes a command. We never think of trying to control any attitude. And if it becomes very obvious that we have to control an attitude, we become neurotic. We are frustrated, and we feel definitely that we are injured, that no one has the right to tell us that we should act decently when we do not feel that way. There seems to be no little mysterious break in our circuit by means of which we can turn off some of these intensities. There is no fuse that will blow out in time to prevent us from blowing up. We feel the way we feel, and it has to be that way. When 3 billion people do that, we have endless war, confusion, and conspiracy. We cannot get a group of legislators together to try to keep the peace because they are at war with themselves and each other. Quiet persons in moderate circumstances, with some degree of leisure and a fair measure of insight, are really the salt of the earth. There are some for whom this type of thinking will be difficult for a long while. There are others who are too successful at the moment to worry about the developments that are taking place within their own natures, which are gradually going to lead them into tragedy. So the person who has not too much, and has therefore not become a worshiper of much, an individual who has some leisure, moderation of ambitions, and is satisfied with simple and modest conveniences, this type of person is already the salt of the earth. Of course, he is out of step with the time because he should be out trying to be rich and burdened with ulcers. But lots of people do not agree with this, and they just do not feel they are equipped for this great battle, therefore they don't fight it. Because they have not created so much tension in themselves, they are less often found in the psychologist's waiting room. They are more apt to have the kind of independence that comes to the individual who is not willing to sacrifice his soul for profit. Many of these people are also good church people. They have some religious insight and religious background. They have a little more time for their children, because they're not out trying to make an overwhelming success for themselves. In this area, and in the quietudes of careers that are more or less settled in life, so these individuals know the patterns they are following and can begin to think about themselves and their own lives. In these areas, the relaxation away from these intensities is quite possible. And in the changing of these points of view, we come into another interesting situation. The more tension we have, the more brittle is our relationship with collective life. I have watched and listened to many tense people. They can take a minor calamity and make a major disaster out of it in almost no time flat. They can read a newspaper and they can overlook every little fragment of humanity that is in there and find out only what is wrong. Well, it's true, the newspaper specializes in things that are wrong, because things that are wrong are news. I have news for the newspaper. Anything that is right is news. That is the thing we never hear. And that is the rare thing. News is supposed to be the unusual. Well, right is unusual at this moment. In the simple procedure, however, of integration, the individual gets away from a great many of his negative attitudes about things he cannot change. One thing that happens is that he begins to realize the importance of the very disasters with which we are most concerned. He realizes that without the tragedies that are arising, men will never correct their ways. Therefore, that complication is an invitation to solve the problem, and that this complication must exist in nature until the problem is solved. Little by little, the lawful universe emerges into the conscious awareness of the person who has become thoughtful. He sees the long-range pattern of good and is not completely hypnotized by the immediate spectacle of what is wrong. He gradually finds his own lawful place in the plan of things and realizes that he is not a victim of the mistakes and conspiracies of other people. He only appears to be. He is only a victim while he becomes part of this plan of mutual victimizing of peoples. If he becomes a quiet, constructive citizen of the universe, fulfilling as far as he can those responsibilities which are proper to him, he is not a neurotic. He is not a frustrated person who is held in check by a moral code that he objects to every moment of his life. He is only objecting to what he doesn't understand, or else to a code which itself is not the proper one. Actually, nature does not penalize people for self-control, self-discipline, or self-leadership. It does, however, force these people, by their own insight, to give up some of the foolish things that they had previously thought were good, or at least pleasant. The individual, for example, who finds through his philosophy unfolding a little that he does not need a fifth of bourbon every day to keep himself on his feet, may seem to have deprived himself of one of the greatest joys of living. He will also object to any code suggested by anybody else who doesn't believe in a fifth of bourbon every day. But if he outgrows this, he is certainly not outgrowing anything that he really needs or that was any good to him at any time. He is not only going to enjoy better health, he is going to save a great deal of money, he is going to have a greater clarity of mind with which to do the work of the day, and he is not nearly as likely to be replaced in his business by somebody else who can stay sober. All the advantages lie in self-discipline, but against all this self-discipline lies the psychic drive that the individual wants a fifth of bourbon when he wants it. This is the thing we're confronted with all the time. It isn't always a fifth of bourbon. Sometimes all the individual wants is his neighbor's property. Sometimes all an individual wants is his neighbor's country. But whatever it is almost certainly something he shouldn't have, doesn't need, and will only multiply his tragedies if he gets it. But to him, to get it is success. To be told he shouldn't have it is frustration. In the long pattern of human experience, self-discipline is always a process of releasing oneself from pressures. But most people interpret it as simply adding pressure. Actually, the person who is gradually integrating his own life has more ease, more pleasure, more adjustment with realities than the person who continues to desperately struggle to do as he pleases. In the world today, we have an overwhelming number of persons who insist on their rights to be selfish, to be destructive of each other, to make whatever money they can at the expense of society in one way or another. These people will fight to the death to preserve a way of life in which they can do as they please regardless of whoever it may hurt. If this is pleasure, then the person has to face natural law, for this alone can give him a better insight. This pleasure he has already paid for in misery. This is the thing that is hard to understand. The man who has allowed ambition to dominate his life and who has made the building of a great corporation his only reason for existence has already paid an incredible price for his own folly. He has cut himself off from true happiness. He has destroyed the integrity of his family. He has lost the respect of his children in most cases. He is already half sick and is probably on his way to a neurologist or a psychologist, even while we pick him out of the pages of the phone book at this moment. He is already sick. He hasn't a friend in the world. He is fighting from morning till night to hold power. He is chairman of the board, and everyone is more interested in the chair than they are in him. And there are probably 50 of his closest associates who are hoping he will drop dead. Now this is success. And, of course, in due time he's going to oblige them. He's going to drop dead at 50. Now, to tell the person that this isn't good is to cause him to look at you as though you were stark mad. He is doing what he wants to do. And he is perfectly willing to suffer tremendously for the right to do it. Why then should it seem such a terrible thing to suffer a little, perhaps, for values that are real? Why should the individual not be able to perhaps put some restraint upon his own ambitions and enjoy peace every day as he lives? Have a good family, good children, an interesting personal life, friends who have something to offer in terms of thought or of learning or scholarship or artistry or creativity. Why cannot this individual find joy in simply being a good human being? Nature is with him in this. Nature will stand back of him with everything it has. And actually the price is far less in personal adjustment than in the frantic pattern that we are all trying to live by. If we can begin to sense this, we can say to ourselves, what is the worst for us? That we shall relax a little and say to some troublesome pressure in our own nature, well, let's quiet down a little and think this over. Is this more difficult than it is to go along with this pressure until we have a coronary that lays us on our backs for years. Is this the more complicated pattern? We know definitely that when we say to our inner lives, slow down a little, let's think this through carefully, let's keep our values straight, let's put kindness first, let us try to be decent people. When we say these things to ourselves, we really shock ourselves. We hardly expect such language. But are we not really choosing the easy way? I don't mean the easy way in the sense of weakness. I don't think we should argue ourselves out of a job that needs doing. But I think if we would relax and try to enrich living, we would gain something in the terms of eternal satisfaction. We may find that we're amateurs at it in the beginning. We may not enjoy this process the first week, because no nervous wreck ever enjoys relaxing. You have to gradually develop the knack for it. And a person who has never done any real thinking is not going to be an expert the first day. Let us admit this. But gradually we will discover a wonderful world that we have never known about before. A world of time for creative self-expression. A world in which we can reach out a little bit in kinship to the larger possibilities of living. A world with new arts opening to our consideration, of good books and kindly friends, of adventures of travel, and of learning and gaining insight in numerous ways. There are wonderful, pleasant, quiet things to do that make life richer. And what we need in this world now is a rich life, a life of principles, a life of integrities, so that if by some miraculous circumstance we do get an honest leader, that this individual has someone to support him, that he will not have his entire policy torn apart by a world of selfish people who are only interested in advancing their own causes at the cost of the nation or the world. We cannot live by selfishness. We cannot live by self-centeredness. We cannot live in the constant gratification of self-interest. And when these impulses arise within us, we must use the naturally bestowed power of the will to say we are not going to do that which we know is bad for all of us. This will is there. It has to be encouraged and inspired. Usually the individual only strengthens will through tragedy. But this again is not a law. It is simply a policy. We can each of us take hold of this will factor in ourselves and direct our energies from the core of our beings, and not wait until some terrible outside calamity forces us to adjust our point of view. The individual creates within himself a pressureful attitude toward life. Immediately all life appears pressureful. His own pressures and those of countless others make up environment, and environment becomes pressure-ridden. And because this pressure has no meaning actually to anything except man, it reacts upon man. And the individual begins this vicious circle of pressures that ultimately destroy him as a person and will tear down his world culture if he permits the condition to continue. It all starts, however, with the individual who tries to make a decent decision concerning his own living. This decision begins within himself. It isn't a decision that he has to hang over the front door. It's a decision which perhaps for many years others will not even realize that he has made. The only thing they will notice is that perhaps he is a little more intelligent, a little more patient, and a little more understanding. He is not going to sacrifice anything of value in the common respect of his neighbor. He is not going to lose anything, but he is going to gain the right to sleep without sleeping pills. He is going to have the privilege of using what money he does have for things that are worthwhile instead of paying it out for doctor's bills. He is going to reduce the hazards of life. He is going to have more opportunity to enjoy real associations. He may discover for the first time in his life what a friend is. He will enjoy more the respect of those near to him. And this respect is status. Status is not the individual proud of what he has. Status is other people realizing the integrity of what he is. And anything else has very little significance. So out of all of this problem, it starts with someone, each of us, somewhere along the line, having a nasty idea and saying, no, we're not going to have this idea. We're not going to do this thing. The individual who has just heard a fine bit of gossip rushes quickly to the telephone. It was told him in utter confidence, therefore he is going to tell it to everyone he knows in utter confidence. But stopping halfway to the phone and saying quietly to himself, is this trip necessary? He is going to decide that while this little bit of gossip will make him the hero on the other end of the line for 1 minute, it may cause a great deal of trouble in the future. So he says, no, I'm not going to do it. And he doesn't. About a dozen of these decisions made over a period of a week will suddenly reveal to us that we can make them. We can also say to ourselves, this evening I'm not going to turn on one of these programs, I'm going to do a little reading, a little thought. Or I'm going to spend this evening with my children. Or I'm going to do something a little useful, make something with my hands. Or I'm going to tidy up something that needs being done. Quietly do it. In a short time, we discover the adventure of governing ourselves. An adventure of censoring our own conduct before it becomes dangerous to anybody, including ourselves. And in a very short time, this will become a very interesting habit. And as soon as we make a few wise decisions about these things, the results will begin to show themselves. We will find that we know more, that we are more, and that we are better respected. And in maybe a year or 2 or 3 years, we can control without any great struggle 50 or 60% of our own meaningless impulses. We find out that we can, at any time we want, make the personal use that we desire to make of the energy resources that we possess. The moment we wish to use them wisely, we can. The moment we wish to waste them, we will. Right inside of ourselves begins this process of self-discipline. And out of this self-discipline, which is one of the oldest philosophical rules there are, comes the security that we are looking for. And I want just to read you a couple of sentences from a recent article by J. Edgar Hoover. Mr. Hoover says that among the forces necessary for the perpetuation of the American way of life are discipline and self-discipline, which are vital to any nation governed by laws rather than by men. Now, I think this summarizes our problem. The nation is governed by laws and not by men, primarily. Men only take over when the laws become incomprehensible. In our own lives, We are governed by laws, not by men. The men in these cases might be ourselves. But an individual is finally governed by value. And the purpose that each one of us must fulfill is to find out what the law in him requires and give his obedience and allegiance to those requirements. We know basically that the law requires that men should grow constructively in value, and should improve constantly in those values which are not terminated by death. Until we realize this and recognize this, we have a long way to go in solving our problems. But the tensions of the world are far less difficult if the individual has established quiet control of himself. He will not become hysterical over situations that he cannot control. He will not perpetuate feuds and destructiveness. He will not allow hates to dominate justice. As soon as he begins to think these things through quietly, he will find that the pressure of the world upon him is less, and his destructive pressures upon the world are less, and it will gradually appear that the fact will be made known that world pressure is nothing but the collective pressure of pressured people. If we begin to reduce these pressures in our own lives, we will begin to live the way we were intended to live. And this is not a bad way, it's a rather beautiful way. And we are making it unhappy by refusing to live it well. Well, time's up, so that's all for this morning. Now I'm going to ask you to be patient. I have several rather important announcements which I hope that you will wait to hear. Next Sunday is the last lecture on the present program. You will be receiving your new program in the near future. I will be out of Los Angeles the 2 Sundays following this program. I'll be in San Francisco. So during the period in which I am away, we have something rather special and interesting for you. We have made arrangements through the cooperation of Mr. Lou Ayres to have his 3 religious films shown here during the time in which, a part of the time at least, on which I will be away. These films will be shown on Sunday afternoon, September 27th, Sunday afternoon, October 3rd, and, Sunday afternoon, October 4th, and Sunday afternoon, October 11th. There will be 3 performances, and there will be, I believe, in all 8 films shown in this period of time. These are motion pictures in color with sound, and we think that you will find them interesting and valuable. If you are interested in this series, these meetings will be held on Sunday afternoons. On Sunday afternoon, September 27th, and on October 4th, Sunday afternoon, there will be these lectures. On these Sunday mornings, there will be no lectures. There will be these films in the afternoon, but no Sunday morning meeting. On October 11th, I will be back, and there will be a Sunday morning meeting and also the film on Sunday afternoon. If you are interested in this film, which has been shown in many of the most important cultural and educational religious centers of the world, we hope that you will make necessary reservations for this series. You can reserve the tickets at the morning lecture this morning, after the lecture, after next Sunday's lecture. You may pick them up at our office or phone in for reservations. We suggest this because I'm certain that this particular activity will be rather widely publicized will be of interest to many people, and we have very limited seating accommodation. So we hope that you will bear all this in mind in connection with this series of lectures. I would also like to point out that there will be a meeting of the headquarters group, the PRS study group, after the meeting this morning in the room upstairs, and all who are interested are invited to attend. There is also a very interesting and unusual exhibit in our library on Oriental arts, the history of Buddhist symbolism. Many of the items on exhibition are those which I brought back with me. A few you may have seen before. Others have been here but have not been shown before. Among the pieces on view for the first time in our reading room, you will see this great painting of the Parinirvana of Buddha, which is recently returned from repairs in Japan. It was completely remounted, and it required nearly a year to get it out of the country again because the Japanese government took the attitude that it might well be a national treasure and therefore should not be exported. On the other hand, proof that it had been here enabled us to finally get it out again. It is a very fine painting, probably 14th century, and is extremely large, nearly 7 by 9 feet. So that you will find that in our reading room, also cases of displays, and in the library a large number of interesting religious pieces that you have not seen before. Already we've had a great many visitors, and the exhibition has met very favorable reception. So we hope you will stop and see it. Also in the library you will have opportunity to look over a number of interesting art items, some of which you might like to consider for your homes or something of that nature. This facility also includes material which I brought back with me for this purpose. In the gift shop we have new things coming in all the time, so we hope you'll stop a little bit and take a look there also. In connection with the talk of this morning, we might remind you of the daily words of wisdom, which we think would help you in your resolutions and in trying to think clearly through some of the problems of daily living. We have a special offer on this publication in connection with a new subscription or renewal to our journal. The friends at the table will be very happy to tell you about it. We also would like to note that lecture note 65 is now on the table and available. The subject is Love Has No Enemies. So we hope you will remember the Luaire's meeting, which we think will be of considerable interest to all of you. And don't forget that in spite of all this procedure, I'll be here next Sunday morning. I'm here somewhere. The next Sunday morning is a lecture for everyone over the age of 1 year, and that is the challenge of advancing years. Whether we realize it or not, the human being begins to age the moment he is born. And the rest of the time is a struggle as to what is going to win. And to develop a philosophy based upon the instinct to eternity within ourselves is very valuable. So we hope we'll see you all with us next Sunday morning. Thank you very much.